I'd like to talk about boundary spanning. And as Saul mentioned, I'm a professor at Philadelphia University, where I'm the founding director of the Strategic Design, oops, I have to turn it on. Dennis told me to do that early on. Okay, great. I'm the founding director of the Strategic Design MBA program at Philadelphia University, where we use design thinking as a way to bridge the gap between creativity and strategy. So in design thinking, as a lot of you probably know, if we apply the Pareto rule, 80% of our time is spent in framing the question. Did we even ask the right question before we go running down one of these rabbit holes full of assumptions? So I am in the business of asking a lot of questions. And we like to frame our questions in terms of how might we. So one of the questions that has been really driving a lot of my research and my consulting work is the following question. How might we optimize creativity in the way that we work and in the way that we lead? It's a question that I spent a lot of time fiddling with and having conversations with my students, with my colleagues. I believe one way to look at creativity is in this visual, this image. It's a bit of a mess. In that messiness, there are some insights that we can gather. In design thinking, we say it's through the series of prototyping. But I don't think we really, truly understand creativity, because I think if we understood it more, it would be a lot more integrated into our conversations in the way our organizations are designed and in the ways that we teach. I think often creativity is lobbed into the realm of the arts, and I did an entire doctoral dissertation using jazz music as a heuristic to map the experiential service design delivery at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So I'm a big advocate of that, and I get it. So the arts are an easier on-ramp to understand creativity, but we also know that there is immense creativity in the sciences and in engineering. There's incredible creativity in the ways that entrepreneurs frame their work. So in my view, creativity is a system. It is an integrative system, and it's something that I hope that we can begin to find in a lot of surprising areas. And I have some ideas about how. One of the reasons why it's so important is because we are trying to survive in VUCA environments, in environments that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that term actually came from our US military when we first entered Afghanistan. And for obvious reasons, that terrain was volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And to survive in that VUCA environment, we all throw around this word, innovation. I think that sometimes when we're saying the word innovation, what we're really talking about, in my view, or what I'm really talking about, is creativity. Creativity is actually the means to innovate. And so I want to spend the remaining 10 minutes or so with you exploring one of the principal aspects of creativity, which is boundary spanning. It's the ability to bridge chasms and gaps, to have conversations across disciplines, and to connect silos. And it's incredibly more important in the space that we're trying to teach in. In our schools, I don't know about you, I started in Philly public schools, where K through third grade, the classrooms look a lot like this, very orderly areas. So we teach in these types of environments, in these types of design spaces, and then we go and send off the grown-ups to work in these cubicle environments and then ask people to think outside of the box, which is a bit ironic. So we need to introduce these conversations about creativity into our organizations. And here's another reason why the boundary spanning is so important. All of us have felt in some ways like the diagram on the left, that visual on the left. And that isolation may be because of your gender, and maybe because of class, because you talk about with an accent, maybe because of your ethnicity. Maybe because of the certain skill set and competency that you bring. We need to span boundaries and establish much more curiosity about the innate abilities within each of us so that we have true innovation. In my view, innovation is creating value through reframing. And the more diverse the inputs, the more innovative the output. So we've got to shift to the right side of this image. So then, what's creativity? So as I said, I've given it some thought. I believe creativity is fundamentally a chaotic system. And I was wowed by this stem off of complexity theory during my doctoral studies. My field is design management. I have a background in anthropology and fashion, and I use them every day, all the time. But the chaotic system was just so compelling for me, and everything just clicked after I learned about chaotic systems. And this is a phrase, this is a word that Dee Hock made up. Dee Hock was the founder of Visa, the credit card company. And Dee Hock kept being promoted in this fancy bank, and he was a big naturalist, and he was walking through the woods one day, and he thought, man, I got promoted again, and this time they're telling me I've got to create this global, international, virtual banking system that spans across 200 countries, 20,000 people, and in our human organizations, we try to design them in these hierarchical ways. But all around us in nature, things are emergent. Things are self-organizing. So what if I tried to design, just for this project, an emergent self-organizing system, a chaotic system, one that is built of chaos and order? Chaos is not anarchy. Chaos is randomness. And order is not control. Order are boundaries. They are these divides that we need. And creativity, similarly, is a chaotic system. Creativity is not doing whatever you feel like, right? Creativity requires intense amount of paying attention paid to rules and boundaries, intensive study, isolation also sometimes. And then once you understand what those boundaries are, you can push against them and go buck wild and innovate some really cool stuff. So my entree into experimenting with this stem of complexity theory, chaotic systems thinking, was by looking at improvisational organizations, and specifically using jazz as a way to understand that. And so here's that easy on-ramp, right? So you think about what a jazz musician does. Jazz musicians must know music theory. They have a loosely structured composition that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have intense practice, and they know their craft. And then what happens in the in-between bits is the magic. It's the beauty. And that was really interesting to me. And from that, one of the insights that I got was that more of our organizations need what I call fluid structures with some fluid boundaries. A few years later, I built out my framework for creativity a little bit more. I thought, before we even get to improvisation in this chaotic system we call creativity, there's intuition and there's insight. And before that, there's curiosity. So my framework that I work from is this idea that without curiosity, we have nowhere to go. We must start with curiosity. We must start with the ability to ask questions, which draws directly back to the types of environments that we're learning in and that we teach in, and the types of environments and organizations that we show up in and that we allow our associates to show up to. We also need intuition. Intuition, to me, is pattern finding. It's that nudge of, I've seen this before, I've heard this before, I've felt this before, I've already talked about improvisation, and finally that gets us to insight. That's my working framework for creativity. And what's also cool is that there's a really nice feedback loop between being able to intuit and practice intuition, because intuition is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. The less you use it, the more flaccid it gets in improvisation. And they feed one another. So I've started a new section of my research where I've started interviewing a number of people around intuitive leadership. I chose to interview a chef initially, a DJ, a dancer choreographer, and a game designer, because I figured these might be my baseline of work habits where you must do a lot of pattern finding and you must intuit. So within that pattern finding and these interviews, I noticed an emergent pattern in my data. And the emergent pattern was the physicality that each of these folks brought to their work. And I thought, that's interesting, probably interested me, because I have a rich history with physicality. So I'd like to present to you my working theory on optimizing creativity in order to span boundaries. So here goes. I'm going to experiment with telling the story through the story of swimming and me. Because as I said, an easier on-ramp to discussing creativity are the arts. I'm going to try to practice what I preach and explore creativity through some would argue, a non-artistic venture, such as swimming. Swimming is a chaotic system. The randomness, the chaos part is the play, which is probably the first way we fall in love with the sport. And then the order component is the technique. And in between that, some might say is survival, as I say, is swimming. So what I took from those initial interviews around my project on intuitive leadership are the physical and sensorial dimensions that were emerging, which was really interesting to me because I, upon reflection, realized that all these touch points in my life, where breakthrough in my life was highly connected to my physicality. So for example, my mom tells me that when I was a baby and she was exercising outside of the playpen where she had me to simmer down, and she'd be doing her exercises to lose her baby fat, I would just start mimicking her and vigorously trying to catch up with her, and that was one of the reasons that she put me into dance class. The other reason is that I'm very clumsy. The second touch point for me around my physicality and heightened sensorial connection is I studied dance. And that certainly is something that involves that acute attunement to your physicality. I studied modern dance growing up. The third point was that at age 15 in my high school, when entering your junior year, you were given the task to do a junior project that was supposed to be a month long. I chose Outward Bound. And I learned about Outward Bound when I was a 7th grader. I was a new student at this school, and it rocked my world. And I thought, I want to do that. I want to climb off a mountain. I want to climb up a mountain. I want to rappel. I want to do all of that. And that was, again, a major breakthrough moment for me in my identity and my sense of self. And I'll stop there. Those are enough. So the other issues around boundary spanning and swimming for me are several. One is, the boundaries that we span in swimming are between the elements, so we literally go from the earth into another element of water, and you're navigating another way of movement and breath through the water and through air. The second boundary spanning that I find that I often do is through the meditative state of doing laps and the cognitive state that often merges into this metacognitive state where I emerge from a swim and I just figure stuff out. The third evidence of boundary spanning that I've experienced is that acute attunement to the interior. So there's just a heightened awareness of the breath. There's a heightened awareness, especially when you're swimming through the ocean, of a very different interior environment of the earth. So the story of swimming and me takes place in 3 acts. Act 1, play. So I started out with this image of my dad, my younger sister, Mercedes, and me on the beach. My mother is a part of this picture. I was like, she's taking the photo. There's another photograph of my dad, me and my sister, Mercedes, on a raft. And then that's me in the background playing. So this play component, this first introductory of swimming for me, started with my mom taking us to the YWCA. If you're from Philly, you know, shout out to Germantown. The Germantown Y is where I learned how to swim. Woohoo! And I loved the water, so much so that sometimes I would start to turn blue in summertime when we'd be in the water. And I grew up in a neighborhood in Philly where the public pool at the rec center had boys who would jump into the water with their cut-off jeans on. So for my father to expose us to these other new types of environments of swimming was true boundary spanning. But the play that I experienced, what I understand about that now is that play is actually a method of inquiry. Play is a means of experimentation. And how might we integrate play into the way we work and into the way we teach? I've given that some thought. Act 2 is around practice. So fast forward another 20 years, and I studied abroad in Brazil. And I was studying abroad in Brazil in the 1990s. And if you know anything about the economic history of Brazil, around that time, from the 70s really through the mid 90s, Brazil was changing its currency radically, and at that time it was the Cruzeiro. And the strength of the dollar was amazing, so I felt like a rich lady. And I was actually able to take proper swimming lessons because although I got accustomed to the water and felt comfortable in the water, I didn't really know how to swim. Like I couldn't really swim laps in the way that I really wanted to. So I took swimming lessons. I took swimming lessons from an older Brazilian man named Fernando. Fernando was about 70 years old. He didn't speak a lick of English. And at the time, my Portuguese was mais ou menos. It wasn't that good. Fernando really taught me a new way to breathe. And he spent the entire 5 months that I studied with him having me at the edge of the pool and learn to breathe a new way. Breathe out with your nose, in with your mouth. Out with your nose, in with your mouth. And what was amazing about that is that I learned that the intuitive can become something that can be an outgrowth of the practice. But this also brings home, there's the non-sexy part of creativity. There's the rigor and the practice and the borders that we need. Act 3. Act 3 is a bit more recently, another 20 years pass. So I can swim back and forth in the ocean, loving it. But around 2012, about 3 years ago, I realized I had real flip-turn envy. I mean, I would just look at people who could do laps continuously. They would swim to the end. They wouldn't have to stop and turn around physically. They could swim to the end, do that turn, and continue on. I thought, man, I want to learn how to do that. And I asked a woman who gave swim lessons at our gym if she could teach. She said, no, I never really swam competitively. I just teach the little kids. I was like, okay. So I decided to teach myself watching YouTube videos. So what's interesting about this is I shift my modality of how I was learning. From human to human in person to this self-learning. And I experienced extreme embarrassment in the gym because I was awful at it. And I would use that noodle, and I would get water up my nose, and I looked awkward and goofy, and it was embarrassing. But I had to go through that stage in that phase of total and utter awkwardness. And one day, I decided I'd give up because my flip turns just kept being lopsided. They weren't nice and smooth. Gave it for about 3 weeks. I decided at the end of those 3 weeks, let me just try to Google this again. Maybe there's something I just misread I'm not getting. So I Google it. I pull up a new article. 10 steps to perfect the flip turn. Brilliant. Step number 3 said, whatever you do, as you're approaching the wall and your arms go down, you have to exaggeratedly tuck your chin. And I thought, maybe I didn't do that. So the next morning, I go to the gym, I psych myself up, I approach the wall, I exaggeratedly tuck my chin, and it was beautiful. My body just flipped, my feet hit the wall, I pushed off, and I was off. So what was cool for me about that lesson was that little adjustments can create huge magnanimous shifts. And that's actually also a part of chaos theory. It's part of the butterfly effect, right? That the flapping of a butterfly's wings in the Amazon jungle can cause a tsunami in Sri Lanka. This notion that we don't have to always make these huge, crazy leaps to create great change was an important lesson for me. So these 3 touch points in my life of learning to play and love the water, of understanding the rigor of practice and learning a new way to breathe, of teaching myself and being patient with myself, and then the aha moment of that slight adjustment and the cascading effect of that was huge. So here's my working theory, right? That boundary spanning requires some play, it requires some practice, and it requires some perspective. And you can scale that in a number of ways. You can scale that in an hour's time. You can scale that over decades, as I had in this instance. There are also spatial and temporal dimensions to that. And the spatial dimensions, of course, have to do with that other sense of your physical body and your senses. The temporal dimension has to do with the adjustments in time in order to attain that innovation. In the Strategic Design MBA program, we practice play by having MBA classes in design studios with whiteboards spaced everywhere and tables are on wheels. No chairs nailed to the ground with stadium seating. The practice that we constantly are harping on to students is that design thinking is intuitively simple because there's a lot of intuitiveness about it. The complexity of design thinking comes in how do you scale it? How do you figure out when to use which tools when? And that only comes through time on task. And the final shift is perspective. It's the ability to empathize and to understand that in the reframing of the question, it's that slight subtle shift that leads to the exponential change. So here's my final takeaways for us. The real value proposition of creativity and integrating into the way we're approaching innovation is boundary spanning. It's to understand the boundaries that you yourself have spanned, that those in your organizations can span. Boundary spanning is each of our superpower. And I want to leave you with this question. Well, I'm going to leave you with two questions, but here's first. Where in the world can you identify chaotic systems? Because if you're like me, once you start learning about chaotic systems, you find them everywhere, and you seek to build them in to the way that you live and work. So let's breathe differently. Thank you.